Somewhere in the suburbs of Wayzata, Minnesota, there is a corporate campus so deliberately unremarkable that most people drive past it without a second glance. No towering glass skyscraper, no iconic logo visible from the highway. Just a quiet collection of mid-rise buildings surrounded by manicured lawns, sitting at the edge of Lake Minnetonka, like it belongs to an insurance company or a regional accounting firm. But inside that building, decisions are made every single day that determine what gets stocked on the shelves of every grocery store in America. What your beef costs, what your bread is made of, what your children's cereal contains, what the entire nation eats, and what it pays to eat it. Most people think America's food industry is a competitive marketplace. Hundreds of brands, thousands of products, farmers selling freely, prices set by supply and demand. They are looking at the label, not at what's inside. Beneath the colorful packaging and the illusion of consumer choice lies one of the most concentrated, most deliberately hidden power structures in the history of American capitalism. A single-family dynasty, spanning 6 generations, controlling an empire valued at over $160 billion, that has quietly positioned itself as the invisible backbone of everything you eat. This is not a story about a brand you recognize. That's exactly the point. In this video, we are tracking the Cargill-MacMillan family, the most powerful dynasty in American history that you have almost certainly never heard of. We are going to uncover how a single family built a private empire so vast that it touches nearly every meal eaten in the United States, and yet has managed to stay almost completely invisible to the public for over 160 years. We're going to expose the specific mechanisms, the holding companies, the private structures, the government relationships, and the strategic marriages that have allowed this family to consolidate control over the global food supply without ever answering to a single shareholder, a single regulator, or a single journalist granted full access. And wait until you hear about the specific moment, buried in a 1909 federal investigation, that should have broken this empire apart forever, but didn't. By the end of this video, you will understand why the food on your plate is not the result of a free market. It is the result of a dynasty that decided, generations ago, that they would own the entire game, and then spent 160 years making sure no one noticed. Let's start with what most people believe, because the story the food industry tells about itself is actually a very convincing one. Walk into any American grocery store, and what do you see? Choice. Overwhelming, almost paralyzing choice. Hundreds of cereal brands. Dozens of beef suppliers. Organic options next to budget options, next to premium options. Store brands competing with national brands, competing with regional favorites. Farmers markets on the weekend, selling directly from the farm to your table. It looks, on the surface, like the purest expression of free market capitalism. The narrative goes something like this. American agriculture is the envy of the world. Family farmers grow the crops. Independent processors handle the supply chain. Competing corporations bid for those products and bring them to market. Retailers compete for your dollar. And somewhere in the middle of all that beautiful competition, you, the consumer, win. This is the story that gets told in USDA press releases, in congressional testimony, and in the glossy sustainability reports that major food companies publish every year. America feeds the world, and it does it better than anyone else through the miracle of the open market. And here's the thing, parts of that story are even true. America does feed the world. Its agricultural output is genuinely staggering. In 2023, the United States exported over $196 billion worth of agricultural products. The breadbasket metaphor is not an exaggeration, but a free market, a system of genuine competition, that part of the story starts to fall apart the moment you look at who actually controls the infrastructure underneath all of it. Not the brands, not the retailers, not even the farmers. The infrastructure, the grain elevators, the shipping corridors, the processing plants, the commodity trading desks, the invisible machinery that everything else depends on. Because whoever controls the infrastructure, doesn't just participate in the food industry. They own it. So, when did the cracks start showing? When did researchers, journalists, and government investigators first begin to notice that something about America's food supply didn't quite add up? It starts with a number that most people have never heard, but that should stop you cold the moment you understand what it means. 4 companies control approximately 85% of all beef processing in the United States. 4 companies control roughly 66% of all pork processing. And in the global grain trade, the buying, selling, storing, and shipping of the corn, wheat, and soybeans that feed both people and livestock across the entire planet, just 4 companies handle an estimated 70 to 90% of all global volume. This cartel has a name in academic and agricultural policy circles. They call it ABCD: Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. 4 companies, controlling the majority of the world's food supply chain. But here's the crack in the wall. 3 of those 4 companies are publicly traded. They have shareholders. They file disclosures. They answer, at least in theory, to regulators and to the public. Cargill is not. Cargill Incorporated has never had a single share of stock traded on any public exchange in its entire 158-year history. It has never been required to publish detailed financial statements. It has never faced a hostile takeover. It has never had to justify its structure, its pricing, or its political relationships to anyone outside of its own family ownership. It is the largest privately held company in the United States, with estimated annual revenues of $177 billion as of its most recent fiscal reporting, and it operates almost entirely in the dark. That anomaly, that one company at the center of the global food supply deliberately structured to avoid all public scrutiny, is not an accident. It is a design, and the architects of that design have a name. The story begins in 1865. The Civil War has just ended. America is broken, rebuilding, and hungry. And a young entrepreneur named William Wallace Cargill sees something that most people miss entirely. He doesn't look at the devastation and see tragedy. He looks at it and sees grain. Specifically, he sees the problem of moving grain. Farmers in the expanding Midwest are producing more wheat, more corn, more oats than the country has ever seen. But getting that grain from the field to the city, storing it, transporting it, pricing it, that is a logistical nightmare that nobody has solved yet. William Wallace Cargill decides he will be the one to solve it. He opens his first grain storage warehouse in Conover, Iowa in 1865. Then another. Then another. Within a decade, he has built a network of grain elevators stretching across the upper Midwest, quietly positioning himself not as a farmer, not as a food producer, but as the essential middleman between the people who grow the food and the people who need it. This is the founding insight of the entire Cargill empire, and it has never changed in 158 years. Don't own the farm. Own the infrastructure the farm depends on. By the time William Wallace Cargill died in 1909, the company was already massive, but it was also nearly destroyed. A catastrophic overextension into railroad speculation had pushed Cargill to the edge of bankruptcy, and a federal investigation into the company's grain trading practices had exposed serious questions about market manipulation. This should have been the end. Instead, it was the beginning of the dynasty's second, more powerful chapter. Because when William Wallace Cargill died, control of the company passed to his son-in-law, John MacMillan Sr., and the MacMillan family did something that would define the empire for the next century. They closed the doors, not literally, but strategically, financially, and structurally, they sealed the company off from the outside world. John MacMillan Sr. reorganized Cargill's debts, rebuilt its balance sheet, and made a decision that every subsequent generation has honored like sacred law. Cargill would never go public. It would never take outside investors. It would never dilute family control. The company would grow, expand, and eventually dominate. But it would do all of it from behind a wall of private ownership that the outside world could never fully see through. And grow it did. Through the Great Depression, when Cargill bought distressed grain assets at pennies on the dollar while competitors collapsed around them. Through World War II, when government contracts to supply the Allied forces turned the company into a global logistics machine almost overnight. Through the post-war boom, when American agricultural exports exploded, and Cargill was already perfectly positioned, with the grain elevators, the shipping infrastructure, and the commodity trading expertise, to capture the majority of that growth. By the 1970s, Cargill had expanded into animal feed, vegetable oil processing, cotton trading, and financial services. By the 1980s, they were operating in over 60 countries. By the 1990s, they had moved into meat processing, salt production, and steel manufacturing. By the 2000s, Cargill was quietly one of the largest financial trading operations in the world, not just in food commodities, but in energy, metals, and derivatives. But here is the mechanism that makes all of this more than just a big company. Here is what separates Cargill from every other large corporation in America: the ownership structure. Approximately 90% of Cargill's shares are owned by roughly 280 descendants of the founding Cargill and MacMillan families. There is no public market for these shares. They cannot be purchased by an outside investor. They cannot be seized in a hostile takeover. They are passed down through bloodlines, managed through a labyrinth of family trusts and holding structures, and governed by an internal family council that operates entirely outside of public view. The remaining 10% is owned by Cargill employees, also not publicly traded. This means that one extended family dynasty controls the infrastructure behind the majority of America's food supply, and they are accountable to absolutely no one outside of their own bloodline. That is not a company. That is a sovereign apparatus. Let's talk about what that control actually looks like in practice, because numbers on a page don't capture it. You need to feel the scale of what this family has built. Every single day, Cargill processes enough food to feed hundreds of millions of people. They operate over 1,500 facilities in 70 countries. They employ approximately 160,000 people worldwide, more than the entire active duty United States Marine Corps. Their annual revenue of $177 billion is larger than the GDP of Hungary, Kuwait, and Morocco combined. But raw size is not the point. Plenty of large companies are large. What makes the Cargill-MacMillan dynasty different is not how big they are. It's where they sit. They don't sit at the top of the food industry. They sit underneath it. Think about the journey of a single ear of corn from a farm in Iowa to a product on your grocery store shelf. That corn is grown using fertilizer that Cargill may have supplied. It is harvested and transported to a grain elevator that Cargill likely owns. It is graded, stored, and traded on a commodities market, where Cargill is almost certainly one of the largest participants. It may then be sold to a Cargill processing facility, where it is turned into corn syrup, animal feed, ethanol, or starch. That animal feed goes to a livestock operation, possibly one that Cargill has a financial relationship with. That livestock gets processed in a facility that Cargill owns or operates, and the final product gets shipped through a supply chain where Cargill's logistics infrastructure is involved at multiple points. You never see the name Cargill on the package, but Cargill's fingerprints are on virtually every step of the process. This is what agricultural economists call vertical integration, the control of an entire supply chain from raw input to finished product. But Cargill's version of vertical integration is so complete, so deeply embedded across so many different commodity categories, that it has moved beyond mere business strategy into something closer to systemic control. Consider the beef industry. Cargill is the largest beef processor in North America. Their XL Beef brand processes an estimated 25% of all beef consumed in the United States. Combined with just 3 other companies, Tyson, JBS, and National Beef, that number rises to over 85% of the entire market. This level of concentration is so extreme that in 2021, when a single cyber attack temporarily shut down JBS processing plants, beef prices across the entire United States spiked almost immediately. That is not a competitive market. That is a system so concentrated that a single disruption can move national prices within 48 hours. And Cargill is the largest player in that concentrated system. Now, extend that logic across every other commodity they touch. Cargill handles an estimated 25% of all U.S. grain exports. They are one of the largest processors of cocoa and chocolate globally, meaning their decisions affect what candy companies pay for ingredients worldwide. They are a dominant player in palm oil trading, which appears in roughly 50% of all packaged consumer products sold in grocery stores. They operate one of the largest animal nutrition businesses on the planet, supplying the feed that goes into the livestock that becomes the meat in your refrigerator. And beyond food entirely, Cargill has substantial operations in financial services, operating one of the largest commodity trading desks in the world. They trade energy. They trade metals. They have, at various points, been more profitable as a financial trading operation than as a food company. This is a family that doesn't just participate in markets. They help set them. When Cargill's trading desks take a position on corn futures, the market moves. When Cargill adjusts its purchasing prices for grain, hundreds of thousands of American farmers feel it in their margins. When Cargill lobbies in Washington, and they do, spending millions annually on federal lobbying efforts, agriculture policy bends in directions that protect and expand their structural advantages. Every time you buy a burger, pour cereal into a bowl, reach for a chocolate bar, or open a bag of chips, somewhere in that supply chain, money is flowing toward Wayzata, Minnesota, toward a family whose name isn't on a single one of those products. That is the architecture of invisible power, and the people who built it live in a world that most of us will never see. Here is the contrast that should make your jaw drop. The company that controls more of your food supply than any other entity on Earth has no celebrity CEO, no charismatic founder doing TED Talks, no family member sitting on the cover of Forbes with a practiced smile and a rehearsed origin story. The Cargill-MacMillan family has spent 6 generations cultivating something far more valuable than fame. They have cultivated invisibility. And yet, behind that invisibility, the lifestyle this dynasty enjoys is staggering in its scale and its deliberate privacy. The combined wealth of the Cargill and MacMillan family descendants is estimated at over $160 billion, making the family collectively one of the wealthiest in human history. To put that in context, that figure is larger than the individual net worth of Warren Buffett. It is enough to buy every single NFL franchise in existence and still have tens of billions remaining. It is generational wealth so deep and so compounded that individual family members, all roughly 280 of them, are, by any reasonable measure, among the richest people on the planet, most of whom you have never heard a single thing about. The most prominent publicly known member of the family in recent decades was Pauline MacMillan Kyneth, a granddaughter of John MacMillan Sr., estimated by Forbes to be worth over $8 billion at her peak. She gave occasional charitable donations. She appeared at select philanthropic events, and then she retreated, as the family always does, back behind the curtain. The family's physical footprint matches its financial one. Cargill family estates are concentrated in the upscale enclaves of Minnesota, particularly around Lake Minnetonka, one of the most exclusive residential areas in the Midwest, where waterfront properties regularly sell for $5 million to $20 million, and where old money moves quietly and without announcement. Family members have maintained estates in Florida, Colorado, and internationally, though the full picture of their real estate holdings is, by design, almost impossible to fully document. Their philanthropy, when it surfaces, is strategically directed. The family has donated hundreds of millions to institutions like the Minneapolis Institute of Art, various conservation land trusts, and agricultural research programs at major universities. But notice the pattern. The giving consistently reinforces the family's image as quiet, responsible stewards of wealth, never as the architects of a market-dominant empire. It is philanthropy as reputation management, generosity as armor. Contrast all of this with the reality of the American farmer, the person the Cargill dynasty depends on to produce the raw materials of their empire. The average American farm generates a net income of roughly $100,000 per year before accounting for debt service, equipment costs, and the volatility of commodity prices that Cargill's own trading desks help to influence. Many family farms operate on margins so thin that a single bad harvest or a single bad pricing year can end operations that have existed for generations. The people at the bottom of Cargill's supply chain are fighting for survival. The people at the top are quietly worth more than most nations. And the genius, or the cruelty, depending on your perspective, of the entire architecture is that the farmers, the consumers, and even most policymakers have almost no idea how complete that control really is. But some people have started asking questions, and what they've found is deeply unsettling. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because for all that we know about the Cargill-MacMillan dynasty, the revenues, the market share, the supply chain dominance, there is a staggering amount that remains deliberately, structurally unknown. And that is not an accident. In 2019, a coalition of agricultural advocacy groups and independent researchers published a landmark report titled Feeding the Few: Corporate Control of Food Systems, documenting in exhaustive detail how a handful of companies, led by Cargill, had achieved a level of market concentration in the American food supply that would have triggered immediate antitrust action in almost any other industry. The report called for congressional investigation, structural reform, and mandatory financial disclosure for companies controlling critical food infrastructure above a certain market threshold. The response from Washington was almost complete silence. Cargill's federal lobbying operation, which has spent an estimated $50 million or more over the past 2 decades influencing agricultural policy, trade agreements, and food safety regulation, had done its work well. The company has maintained deep relationships with both Republican and Democratic administrations across 6 decades, positioning itself not as a political actor, but as an essential partner in American food security. When you are responsible for feeding hundreds of millions of people, governments don't regulate you. They need you. But the questions keep piling up. In 2021, Cargill was named by environmental investigators as one of the largest corporate contributors to Amazon deforestation. Their soy purchasing operations in Brazil linked to the destruction of millions of acres of rainforest to create farmland. The company issued statements, published sustainability commitments, and continued operating largely as before. In the same year, a series of price-fixing investigations across the beef processing industry, involving Cargill and its major competitors, raised serious questions about whether the concentration of market power in American meat processing had allowed these companies to coordinate pricing in ways that cost American consumers and farmers billions of dollars. Lawsuits were filed, some settlements were reached, but the structural conditions that made the alleged coordination possible remained entirely intact. And then, there is the question that no one in Washington seems willing to ask out loud. What happens to America's food supply if this empire ever fractures? The Cargill-MacMillan family currently holds together through a complex web of family trusts, internal governance agreements, and a shared financial interest in maintaining private ownership. But with approximately 280 family members now sharing ownership, spread across multiple generations, multiple branches, with inevitably diverging interests and priorities, the internal pressures on that structure are growing. There have been whispers, documented in financial and agricultural trade publications, of family factions pushing for partial public listing, of disagreements over environmental strategy, of younger generation members questioning whether the obligations of running a $177 billion food empire are worth the constraints of the family ownership model. If Cargill ever goes public, if the wall ever comes down, the exposure of what this family has built and how they built it would be one of the most significant corporate revelations in American history. But that assumes the wall comes down on someone else's terms. This family has spent 158 years making sure that nothing happens on anyone else's terms. The game is not over. It may never be over. And the most chilling part of this entire story is not the power that has already been accumulated. It is the power that we still cannot see. Step back for a moment. Zoom all the way out. What you have just learned is not really a story about grain elevators in Iowa, or commodity trading desks in Minnesota, or beef processing plants in the American Midwest. Those are just the details. What this is really a story about is something far older and far more fundamental. It is a story about what happens when one family is patient enough, disciplined enough, and strategically invisible enough to let an entire civilization build itself around their infrastructure, without ever once looking down to see whose hands are holding it up. The Cargill-MacMillan dynasty did not get here through luck. They got here through 6 generations of deliberate, compounding, ruthlessly focused accumulation of the one thing that all other power depends on: control of what people need to survive. Every empire in history has understood this. The families that last, the dynasties that outlive governments, outlast recessions, and survive revolutions, are never the ones with the loudest names. They are the ones who own the thing underneath the thing. The road beneath the city, the port beneath the trade route, the grain elevator beneath the entire food supply. You will eat 3 meals today, and somewhere in the invisible architecture of at least one of them, a family in Wayzata, Minnesota, will have played a role. Now here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Is this the natural, inevitable result of capitalism done brilliantly? Or is a food supply controlled by a single private dynasty, accountable to no one, one of the most dangerous concentrations of power in modern civilization? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this video changed the way you think about what's on your plate, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel reach the people who need to see this story. And if you want to go deeper, next time, we are pulling back the curtain on another dynasty that operates in plain sight, hiding the full extent of their power behind one of the most recognizable brands in American history. You think you know this family. You don't.